Welcome to our first of the 2025-2026 webinar series with Operation Injured Soldier. And we are talking today about invisible battles. And we're specifically talking about understanding moral injury. And we are talking about understanding post-traumatic stress disorder. And I wanted to start with a quote here. I wanted to start with this reality that not all wounds bleed, and many wounds live inside, affecting identity, relationships, and a sense of what is right in the world. And if you do have the document, we're following along here, so you'll be able to follow along as we go through. But I wanted to point out here that post-traumatic stress disorder arises after experiencing overwhelming threat or horror. The symptoms reflect the body's attempt to survive long after the danger has passed. And if you can follow me just for a second, everybody who is on the screen or everybody who's watching here, put your hand up like this and fold your thumb in like this. Put your fingers over like this. Okay, you can put your hand down, but I'll keep mine up. There is a researcher known as Dan Siegel. He is a leading authority on trauma, and he talks about how we have an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. And we have something called the amygdala that switches us from up to down. What we have is we have what is called the prefrontal cortex, and then we have the limbic system. And what happens in moments of high stress and high duress is that our brain shifts from upstairs, which is called the prefrontal cortex, to downstairs, which is called the limbic system, which is meant for our survival. I'm in my office right now, and if a bear walked into my office right now and really didn't walk and lumbered in, let's say a bear lumbered into my office, the part of my brain that is meant for survival would engage, and I would move into what is called a fight or flight response. There's actually 6 stress responses. We'll talk about that as we go through, but I would have a survival instinct that kicked in that I would need to kick in order for me to survive. It's super important. It's necessary. And yet, if it didn't kick in, what would happen is I would stay in what would be called my prefrontal cortex or my upstairs brain. And that's the part of the brain that is necessary for creativity. That's the part of that's necessary for compassion and understanding and logic and reason. So if a bear lumbered in and I was in my upstairs brain or my prefrontal cortex, effectively I would say something like this. Well, I wonder what kind of bear that is. Is that a brown bear? Is that a black bear? If a bear came into my office and I was in my upfront brain, I'd essentially, or my upstairs brain, I'd essentially get eaten. I need the limbic system to kick in. What happens though is that over time, the brain continues to hunt for similar situations. If I've been in a spot where a bear has attacked me, or if I've been in a spot where a bear is coming after me, my brain will continue to hunt for those same situations for my survival. And that's effectively what happens when we go into moments of high stress and high duress. We fall into what is called post-traumatic stress. When we've been through high seasons of stress and duress, our brain and our body adapt and change. And because of the high amounts of pain that we've either witnessed or gone through, or the high amounts of horror, our brain changes. And that is why people move into what is commonly known as, after large or hard traumatic events, people move into what is commonly known as post-traumatic stress. And I want to pull this up for you here because there are some pretty specific examples of symptoms that people experience in post-traumatic stress. When I work with individuals who have gone through traumatic experiences, these are common. We have intrusion, which is flashbacks and nightmares. So that is common for individuals who have gone through highly traumatic events. We have avoidance, which is where people are emotionally numb or they avoid any kind of reminders or cues of what has occurred. I had a professor who had been through the Vietnam era and he survived horrific combat experiences and he avoided large crowds. He avoided loud noises. He actually had sensitive hearing equipment that kept him from hearing explosions and filtered out like mortar bursts that would occur around the 4th of July. Those are ways or symptoms of what happens during post-traumatic stress. Hyperarousal. Well, this is where the basically the nervous system, when it is aroused or awakened, our nervous system is on high alert. If you are on high alert all the time, you may be irritable. You may have some jumpiness. You may have trouble sleeping. Um, Negative thought or mood shifts. Shame, guilt, and hopelessness are super common. From a neurobiological standpoint, trauma locks the brain into survival mode. Memory is stored in sensory fragments and not necessarily in narrative fashion. And so, this is the way that I explain it to my clients, and this is the way that I explain it to people I'm working with when they're going through trauma. Trauma essentially disintegrates. Trauma fractures our memory. Trauma puts our memory of experience is into different places to in an effort to try to keep the brain from experiencing more pain or in an effort to try to make sense of what happened. Trauma fragments everything, and healing reintegrates. Or when we remember something, it'll put it back in a different spot. And so if you think about it like this, it's super common for individuals who have been through traumatic experiences to not remember the whole story. They'll remember bits and pieces. They'll remember fragments of what happened, but they won't actually remember the full narrative of what's occurred because it can be really, really hard. We got a couple of people here in the chat that I just want to pull up. One, Kyle, I think, just said, I find that I have experienced all of those PTSD responses over the years at different levels of intensity, which is absolutely true. The reality is, once a trauma is stored in our body, we are essentially made up of memories. So our bones, or our bodies are made of bones and tissue and sinew, but our souls are made up with memories. And essentially what trauma does is it puts our memories into like this floating place in our soul. And until we recognize it, until we deal with it, until we heal from it, we can't put that into basically a nice little compartmentalized box where the memory is taken care of. It just, those memories just kind of float in us. And so it's very common to have all of the symptoms that are noted here. And of course, this is not a comprehensive list, but it is very possible to have all of these symptoms happening at one time or another. And they might happen to a greater degree depending on the trigger that invoked that memory or that response. From a human impact, trauma and post-traumatic stress can give us a loss of identity. We actually don't know who we are anymore. It can leave us in a state of isolation. We can live in a state of hypervigilance, again, always being on high alert, and it can lead to significant relationship strain, whether that is with a spouse or a significant other or family members or loved ones. After a while, it can be really, really hard to interact with people. One, some people who just don't get it. Some people just don't understand. And maybe you've had this if you've ever struggled with post-traumatic stress or you've ever worked through some signs or symptoms of stress, maybe you've had people say things to you like, well, just get over it. Or, well, just my personal favorite is just pray about it or just go to God with it, which I'm a pastor and I'm a therapist. And I believe that prayer and going to God can be very helpful. And sometimes it just feels like people don't understand what's really going on. And so it can lead to a lot of relational strain. So that's post-traumatic stress. Let me pause for a second because I think we built in some time here. Any questions on what I have just said or talked about? Or would you like for me to explain a little bit more?
Hey, Josh, I think, not necessarily explanation, but what would you or what have you experienced in your time as a therapist, counselor, as far as what are the common responses that our veterans or someone that's going through PTSD really go to try to minimize the impact? I think we've all kind of done, they're usually not good. We've talked about alcoholism and stuff like that, but I know you've seen some other things that really drive us, and I think that's where that death by uh, how do you say it? Suicide is something. It's
Yeah, death by depression.
death by depression, exactly. And I think that's
Yeah.
something that I want to make sure we hit too. That's a common response after you go through something like this, especially for our veterans that have gone through something that's much worse than the normal everyday average American would ever experience.
Yeah, I think some common, what we would call survival coping mechanisms would be alcohol, substance abuse, numbing out through chemicals. But it's also reckless sexual behavior would be another one, or sexually destructive behavior or undesired sexual behavior, whether that is pornography usage and or uh, affairs and things like that. Basically, finding any way to escape, to numb out. Um, there's a mental health counseling theory called internal family systems, and I'll give just a general overview of it that I think is really helpful. Um, but there are in this internal family systems this understanding that we are made up of many parts. There's a part of us that is wounded and feels afraid or hurt. That part is called an exile. And so if you have been in a traumatic combat situation or you lose a loved one or you see someone get hurt in front of you or the teacher was mean to you when you were in first grade, there's a part of our soul that is hurt by that, and that's called an exile. There's something in us that has been hurt. And then there's other parts that try to protect us from feeling the pain of what we experienced in the past or in the present. And there's a type of part called a manager part, which there's an inner critic in all of us that's a manager that tells us what we should and shouldn't do to keep us from feeling pain that we felt in the past. And then there's also what are called firefighters. And that's the type of part that tries to keep us from feeling pain in the moment. It's going to do anything it can to put out that pain that we feel. And so there's all kinds of different types of firefighters. There's the firefighter that binges out on Netflix or watches shows compulsively. There's a part that drinks, there's a part that eats, there's the part that smokes, there's a part that has sexual activity. And those aren't necessarily all bad. They're just ways to numb out and escape. And here's what I want to say about that, because we will get on to healthy things that we can do to counteract elements of PTSD and ways to find hope forward. Um, if you're watching this and you've experienced some form of traumatic event in your life, there's a really good chance that because you are still alive, there's something that you're doing that's working for you. Now, if it's working well and it's actually healthy, that's a different conversation. But let me just say, the reason why alcohol is a common escape is because it works. The reason why getting high or smoking weed is a great escape is because it works. Sexual behavior, it works. It makes us feel good. It helps us to escape. The problem is, if those are the only coping skills we have, eventually we will get to a place where they become more destructive than they are productive. And once they start to get destructive, and once they start creating more problems as opposed to solutions, it can get really dark and it can get really scary fast. And if we get into a place where our pain and the stress that we experience from that traumatic event exceeds our ability to cope in the moment, we are re traumatized and things get worse. So let's just say, for example, Kyle, that you know of someone, which I know of someone who literally saw people, friends, explode in front of him in the Iraq War. I worked with a gentleman who experienced that. His way of coping was by building structures. Typically, he would build structures out of wood and then order more wood to build those structures and then sell those structures and then build more structures. And so he was a builder and he would buy equipment with the money that he made from building these structures, and he wouldn't tell his wife about it because they were constantly arguing over money, and he didn't like arguing because nobody likes to fight, but fighting reminded him of bad situations. So he had that, and then he was coping with alcohol. And eventually he got to the point where he couldn't afford to keep buying more tools and building more structures, and the alcohol wasn't doing the trick. And then it got scary. And that's actually super common. Um, we got got a question here, which this is great. Great question. Here's the question. How would a person suggest helping someone who may be experiencing some of these things while remaining compassionate, but at the same time relaying that they are not alone in this, especially when they are the type to avoid people, conversation, just plain seem to shut down, and I'm not directly involved, but have been asked to pray and know that they are dealing with a great deal of trauma. Great people, by the way. So I think the question is like, how do you help somebody when you're not directly involved, but you know that there's trauma involved, you know that there's stuff going on, and you're not sure the best way to point. Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is webinars are great. That's why we do them. Just sharing here's what I found. Just sharing information is really, really helpful. Most of the time when people are going through post-traumatic stress or they're going through an event in their life that was really painful and it's handicapping them in some way, this is what they typically think. I'm broken. I'm broken and I'm bad and there's something wrong with me. And here's what I want to tell you. No, that's not true. You're not broken. You're healing from something that broke you. That is the ultimate truth, that we are all in a process of emotional health and a journey of that, some of us to one degree or another. And so sometimes just knowing, hey, this is normal. Like I said to a client once, I said, listen, you saw, you saw dead bodies. You saw things that most people will never see in their entire lifetime. Is it okay if that did something to your soul and sometimes you struggle with it? Yeah, that's okay. In fact, that's a normal response to it. In fact, I would say that post-traumatic stress is a normal response to a severely abnormal experience. And so your brain isn't broken, your soul isn't broken, you're healing from something that hurt you, or you're healing from something that was hard. And depending on how serious you take that healing journey, it may or may not be very productive for you. And so it's way more about just learning and then asking the question, do I have the coping skills to go through it? So that, and what we have more webinars coming up where we're going to unpack a lot more of this. So this is really just that first flyover. And don't whoever asked that question, I'm not going to say your name here, but whoever asked that question, we will actually have a series in this webinar that will talk about how do you help someone who's hurting? What does this look like for caregivers? What does this look like for friends or faith companions who are joining this journey through prayer and support? So, so that is, if we look at it, that is post-traumatic stress. And if you're following along on the document here, I also want to touch on moral injury because these two realities work together. Moral injury is a wound of the conscience resulting from violating deeply held beliefs, witnessing harm, or experiencing betrayal. So, common sources for moral injury would be if you are in an active combat situation and a civilian is harmed in some way, or there's friendly fire, which I've worked with a couple of individuals who were impacted severely or significantly by friendly fire. Um, the inability to save someone. This actually occurs a lot, both in combat and then also I work with police and fire teams. And so this also it was with first responders that you are not able to save an individual that you tried to save. Or on the battlefield, you're given conflicting orders. And you have to choose essentially which order you're going to follow. And that can put you in a space where you are following orders. You're just not following all the orders because you can't, because they don't make sense. Or there's a betrayal or a perceived betrayal by leadership. How it shows up, shame, rage, spiritual distress, questions like, why, God? Why would you allow this? A loss of purpose. Uh, there is a difference between post-traumatic stress and moral injury. Post-traumatic stress is a fear-based trauma. Moral injury is a guilt or a shame or a betrayal wound, and they often overlap. So let me give you a perfect example of moral injury. Years ago, I worked with a person who was in fire and rescue, and a family member of his was emotionally disturbed and compromised and suffering with depression. And this individual saw all of the warning signs for suicide and put plans into place and was actively engaged and was working with their friend. And this person did everything right, everything right, everything right. And their friend still died by suicide. And the guilt of what could I have done? What could I have done differently? What did I miss? That narrative just played over and over and over to the point where it got into a shame experience. And here's the trouble. Post-traumatic stress and this reality of moral injury can co-occur. They can happen at the same time. They're not the same, and the truth is they are treated differently. But post-traumatic stress and moral injury are two major components of what people face in traumatic events or traumatic situations. So let me just pause there and give some space. If people are processing through, or you want to talk maybe a little bit about maybe how you've experienced these differently, or want me to explain a little more, I'm happy to do that.
Josh, I think that's one of the things, if you talk about the PTSD and the moral injury together, from a combat perspective, I think that's one thing that a lot of our vets, even I have, struggled with that over the years. Just to get into some very, high level detail. I've struggled with the fact that I couldn't save someone for it's been almost 20 years.
Mm.
Um, that I in a firefight in the house as the leader, I still lost one of my guys. Um, it was an ambush, had nothing to do with what I was doing, but still to this day, I still want to go back and find what I missed.
Yeah.
And that I've struggled with that for a long time, and I see that every time I see his picture, every time I talk to his wife or his daughter, I can feel that just kind of boiling in the background. That for some reason, I just could not figure it out. I didn't see it coming. And to me, I should have. That was part of my job.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's something that many of us struggle with. Uh, no matter what position you were in, what job you had, there's a level of ownership that our military members feel because we're a family. And
Yeah.
that is a huge loss to lose anybody in that family.
Well, here's the problem with the past is that you can't change it.
Mm.
And yet you can go back and relive the past as many times as you want. And you can think about all the ways that you could have done it differently, would have done it differently, should have done it differently. You could go back, you could write a book on all the things that you would have done that differently that day if you only knew. And here's the problem with the word should, and I cannot overstate this for those listening in this webinar. Should is a cruel word. It's cruel. Should says there's an expectation for perfection that we did not achieve. And and you know this as well as I do. And this is a little bit where this IFS, this internal family system language comes in because Kyle, that little voice in your head that's been dominating your mind for the better part of 20 years, that is what we call an inner critic. But it's an inner critic on steroids. And here's what I can tell you about inner critics. Our inner critic is crueler to us and we say things to ourselves and about ourselves that we would never say to another human being out loud. And if you don't believe me, go golfing sometime. Because when you go golfing, you say things to yourself that you would never say out. In fact, if I said to other people what I say to myself when I go golfing, no one would want to golf with me. And yet I go golfing with myself all the time. And then take that and take it off of the golf course and put it onto a combat field. And then realize that you were in a situation where you were doing the best you could. And here's what I know about the 5 paragraph order or any other military strategy. It's all well and good until the bullets start flying and then your plan goes to crap. And the truth is, if we were to have some self-compassion, and we'll talk about this a little deeper later on, if we were to have some self-compassion when it comes to the decisions we made in the past, and we were able to say, you know what, Kyle, in that moment, you were doing the best you could. That's the truth. And you can go back and you can replay all the events and say, well, I would have done this differently and done this differently. But you're not God. You're not. You're human. And moral injury is about saying, I'm a human being doing the best I can. And I can't go back and I can't change those situations. That's one part of it. There's another part of moral injury that I think is really important too, and that's where we feel betrayed. We feel betrayed by our commanding officer. We feel betrayed by our country. We feel betrayed by our politicians. Um, that's a reality. And when we feel betrayal, that's another form of moral injury. I'm of the opinion that most people who have been in the military have trust issues. Like, we're always just wondering if someone's got a hidden agenda. We're always just wondering if somebody else is trying to get something over on us. We're a little suspicious and a little critical. Yeah. I mean, but if you think about it, there's been a lot of times where our leaders don't always make the best decisions for us. And then just naming that can be really, really, really helpful.
So,
Following up, go ahead, Kyle.
so Josh, just a question to follow that up. So if that's where you struggle as far as giving yourself that same kind of compassion or
Yeah,
understanding that you would give someone else,
yeah,
and that is something that I've struggled with, and I can guarantee you that many of our military members feel the same way. Is we hold ourselves accountable for a lot,
yeah,
and it almost feels like a cop out, to us. That's an inner critic talking, is it's a cop out to say you just did your best when in reality we were trained to be the best.
Yeah.
Somehow you're trying to find a way, you're talking yourself out of being compassionate and still finding a way to blame yourself.
Yeah.
And, and that's a huge struggle.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that military training is about survival in the moment, not necessarily for survival long term. And so, from the individuals that I've worked with in both the military and in police and public safety and first responders, there's a point where you have to say, I mean, the Army had a great saying that wasn't so great. It was great in the short term, but not great in the long term. You ever heard this one? Suck it up and drive on.
Mm-hmm. Used all
Yep,
the time.
all the time. And you know what? That's really helpful when you have to move from one thing to the next because you don't have time to think. You don't have time to go back and play it all back and say, what could I have done differently? No, you got to survive. And so the short-term idea of suck it up and drive on, or the short-term idea of we're here to be the best and we have to be the best and we don't have time to make mistakes. That's all about survival in the immediate. The problem is it doesn't transfer to the long term. Because let me just ask, how does suck it up and drive on for you working for you now? Not great.
No.
Because you don't deal with it, you don't look at it, you don't process through it, you don't work through it. And then you have to carry all the pain of the past that is undealt with. And so, whether it's moral injury, whether it is that inner critic who says you should have done better and you need to do better next time, or it is post-traumatic stress, and you're dealing with this pain that you've been carrying. This, by the way, that stress is physically held in your body. Did you know that? There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, where Bessel van der Kolk, who's a leading researcher on trauma, he says that stress, that kind of trauma, is physically held onto in our bodies. Joint fatigue, joint pain. Our bodies hold on to that pain. If we don't do something to shed that, we don't do something to work through that, it's going to get really hard for us. And so I want to just talk about that because there are some pathways forward for healing that can be really helpful. Um, Rebuilding safety in your body, learning grounding techniques. So, grounding techniques are ways to physically ground your body. Um, Relaxation exercises. There's something called tree therapy. I've seen some research lately that and this sounds a little hokey, but did you know that our Earth has an electrical signal? And when we are barefoot and we are out in nature, if we hold literally hug a tree, we hold on to a tree and we're barefoot. Did you know that actually helps to bring about the electrical signal of the earth back into our body and it helps ground us? Learning how to be still, utilizing breath work. I know it's familiar in the military, but box breathing is a huge way of helping to rebuild safety in our bodies. Learning to recognize your triggers. Again, for one of the men that I knew and I worked with, when he was in large crowds, he would go to Costco or someplace like that. That was very triggering for him, and he needed to be able to recognize that those crowds, the unpredictable nature of people stopping and starting, that was a trigger for him. He needed to learn how to recognize those and communicate those. I mean, simple things like just saying, "Hey, I've got about a 30-minute window in Costco, and then after 30 minutes, I'm going to be overstimulated. So if we're going to go in, we can go for longer, but I'm just going to go out to the car and I will wait for you while I listen to really good music, and then your spouse can finish up shopping." But being able to talk about that is really helpful. What's not helpful is when you're 35 minutes into Costco and you're past your window of tolerance and you start swearing and you start battering, like people with your card, or you start getting really irritable and you start telling the kids to shut up. That's not helpful. That just means that you're not handling your triggers well. Um, Naming the story, moving from silence to truth telling. And Kyle, this is a really important one for both trauma and for moral injury. Um, here's the deal. If you are willing to say out loud, I should have done better, or I should have saved them, and you say that in the power of community, someone else can look at you and say, you know, that's impossible, right? You know, there's nothing you could do. And here's one of the realities that we have found in the psychosocial world. In fact, um, Kurt Thompson, who is another leading researcher on shame and pain, he says that the only way to really heal from shame and trauma is in the power of a safe confessing community. You need to have other people who are around you where you can move from silence to truth telling, who can listen to you and confront the inner critic or narrative that is playing in your mind with truth and love. Reconnecting with identity, rediscovering strength, courage, values, uh, meaning making, and spiritual integration, where you explore beliefs about justice, forgiveness, suffering, hope. You take your experiences and you start working with other people, or you find causes to be a part of. That's why, incidentally, a lot of veterans work with veteran groups because we want something to productively come out of what happened. Um, Community-based healing. So finding peer groups or family education, finding healthy rhythms of exercise or healthy habits, building purpose, or finding ways to find meaning outside of what happened. There's a great book, The Man's Search for Meaning. Um, the author of that book, Viktor Frankl, was a psychologist and he survived the Holocaust. And in his book, he essentially says that we don't find meaning in the midst of suffering or pain. We find meaning in the purpose of what we do after it's occurred. When we get involved in an organization like OIS, when we volunteer at our kids' school, when we lead a support group or we lead a recovery group or we mentor someone, we find meaning in our suffering in the purpose that we're investing ourselves into. And so those are some really helpful and healthy ways to move into healing. Here's a couple tools for healing. Um, Try a 90-second reset. Box breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for two, exhale for six. The numbers may vary, but this idea of just working your way around a box visually can be a really great way. Shame and a triggered stress response can soak into your body in less than 3 seconds. So if crowds are a trigger for you, you can be in Costco for 3 seconds and all of a sudden be triggered, and it will literally physically affect your body within 3 seconds. Before your brain is even aware of it, it can soak into your body. It takes over 90 seconds to move the blood flow back from the limbic system up to the prefrontal cortex. And box breathing, breath work is by far the fastest and most effective way to get back up into that upfront brain. Name it to tame it. Nothing can be healed until you first name it. You cannot get a handle on it. So you have to identify your triggers. You have to identify your reactions to those triggers, the thoughts that you have, and you have to identify a next step. Once you're triggered, what are you going to do about it? Like, what are you going to do when you're triggered? Moral repair practices. These are really helpful. Write a letter of truth. Honestly, Kyle, I would tell you that in those moments for 20 years, you've been haunted by what you could have done. Write a letter of the truth to yourself. And if you can't write a letter of truth to yourself, have somebody else write a letter for you. Like, what's true? The truth is, there's no way you can be the best. That is a false reality. You're a human being who went through really hard things and you did the best you could with what you had in the moment. Having guided conversations, you can do rituals of release where you let them go. Usually, all of these are done within a therapeutic environment or some sort of group environment. Um, Here's when you need to seek a professional. If you have nightmares, panic attacks, suicidal thoughts, or you are starting to decline in your physical, emotional, or mental functioning. Any of those signs, that's when you really need to go see a counselor. That's really when you need to go talk to somebody like me who's a trained professional who can help walk through things like treatment plans, potentially medication, um, inpatient, outpatient, partial hospitalization, especially with suicidal thoughts and ideation. That can get really scary really fast. So let me pause there too, and just if there's any questions or thoughts on that. Okay. I want to walk through a couple of case studies because I find that these are really helpful. And if you have the worksheet, you can do this later and you can walk through this in the worksheet. But I actually feel like it's really helpful. And Kyle, you can be the one who helps us answer the questions kind of as we go through here. But I want to give you a couple case studies. Now, just a couple of things on this. One, I fabricated these case studies based on people that I have worked with in the past, but I changed obviously names and some of the recognizable details. So if any of these ring true for you, I'm not like stalking you. Okay. I am not trying to like Google your life story. These are case studies that are built off of real individuals that I have worked with or I've known in the past. Okay. And so if they resonate with you, that is purely coincidental. Staff Sergeant D sits rigidly on the edge of his bed every 4th of July. His wife and kids gather for fireworks, but he stays inside with noise canceling headphones, pretending to be tired. That night at 2:13 a.m., he jolts awake, heart racing, shirt drenched in sweat, and the boom of the fireworks hours earlier stirred sensory memories from convoy explosions in Afghanistan. Remember, trauma disintegrates. So events can awaken things later on that our memories are not actively aware of. He tells his family he's fine, but becomes irritable and withdrawn for days. He avoids conversations that might bring up deployment, loss, or the things he saw. There are some deeper elements too. He's hypervigilant every night after loud noises. He's checking doors and windows. He has sudden emotional downturn after patriotic holidays. He has shame about not being stronger. He has a belief that talking about it will burden his family, and he doesn't want to weigh anybody else down. And he has a fear that he will lose control emotionally if he opens that door to what happened. So again, these are real events that happen to someone in their life post combat. And just as we go through a couple of questions here, and Kyle, maybe you can help us by pointing out a few, which post traumatic stress symptoms appear in his story?
Just about all of them. So
Correct.
the intrusion, obviously, avoidance, hypervigilance, that negative thought and feelings about himself, um, and then that human impact too comes in as far as a symptom.
Yeah. And so why do you think he might avoid talking about this with other people?
So from a personal perspective, there's probably a number of reasons, but for me, the the thought of tapping into an emotion or becoming emotional is a very scary thought that you don't know what's going to happen. Uh, that was part of, not having the awareness. You're that's beat out of you essentially. You're trained to not have emotions, and then trying to go from none to um, of being vulnerable enough to feel those emotions can really throw things for a loop.
Yeah, yeah. Because in the short time, emotions will get you killed.
Correct.
And the truth is, it's easier to not deal with the emotions on the short term and compartmentalize. Here's the problem, though, for my friends who are listening to this after the fact. Once we move towards 50, we start to lose our ability to compartmentalize. And after 50, every year we move towards 70, we progressively lose more and more to the point where we don't get to keep our feelings in nice, neat little boxes anymore. And they spill out all over the place. And for most men, when we are emotional, we feel icky on the inside. And we don't like feeling icky on the inside. So we'll do everything we can to avoid it and numb out. But the problem is the reason we feel icky on the inside is because our emotions are doing something inside, and getting them out, even as scary as it may be, is one of the most important parts of the healing process. And let me just tell you, especially for my friend, the staff sergeant, um, he was burdening his family by not sharing. Listen, it's going to be hard on your loved ones no matter what. It's going to be hard if you share what happened to you, and it's going to be hard if you don't share what happened to you, because one way or another, it's going to come out. It's either going to come out in a healthy way where they can figure out how they can journey and partner with you, or it's going to come out in unhealthy ways and you're going to wind up hurting them even more. And then you have to feel guilty for hurting them when you could have not hurt them. And trust me, that is not a kind of guilt that you want to hold on to. It's going to come out. And let me just a couple of grounding tools that could really help. One, breathing. He's already got noise canceling headphones, but maybe some breathing exercises. Obviously, some relaxation exercises. If you can predict it, you can plan for it. And you can't predict everything, but again, I hate to go back to the Costco thing all the time, but I think most of us understand that Costco can be really overwhelming and overstimulating. If you know that large groups of people are going to trigger you, you can plan for that. If you can predict that you're going to be triggered, you can have a plan for that. Okay, if I am triggered, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a mindfulness exercise. I'm going to do deep breathing. I'm going to go for a walk outside. I'm going to put on my AirPods and I'm going to limit the amount of sensory that I'm taking. And did you know that when you close your eyes, it actually limits stressful stimulus? And so that's why a lot of people will close their eyes and listen to music and they'll do some breathing. So there's a lot of tools that can be helpful for that. And if you just look through here, a lot of this comes through patriotic holidays. Usually there's memories of combat and things like that. Again, if you can predict it, you can plan for it. And there's hope for that. Um, Here's another case study for you. This one is a little more toward moral injury. Corporal T served with extraordinary courage in a chaotic battlefield environment. During a critical moment of extraction, leadership failed to send backup that they had promised. He and his team were left exposed for over an hour. The event wasn't just dangerous, it was a relational fracture. After redeployment, he received little acknowledgement from command and no accountability for the decision that endangered his unit. He now distrusts authority, avoids leadership roles, and carries simmering resentment. There's some deeper elements here. Insomnia triggered by memories of waiting for rescue, cynicism and deep suspicion toward leaders, loss of belief in the chain of command, emotional numbness, inability to trust even safe people. And then there's this question of if they left us once, why wouldn't others? Um, here's something pretty common with this idea of abandonment or betrayal on the battlefield, especially from leadership. Those trust issues can really mess with your significant relationships. If you're married, It's super common to have questions of like, are they going to be unfaithful? Are they going to cheat on me? Are they cheating on me now? To kind of feel like you're being paranoid. And if you think about it, when you are betrayed at a critical moment or you feel abandoned at a critical moment, that does things to your soul. And so here's just a couple questions. How is betrayal linked to moral injury? Because this one's actually super common. And I know from the men and women that I've talked to at OIS and the men and women I've worked with, having your immediate command fail to show up when they said they would happens all the time in battle. And so how is that kind of betrayal linked to moral injury? And what are some ways that he can rebuild trust? What do you think? Kyle, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the link to moral injury from my perspective is really it's the injury itself is a what I can only describe as a wound, and that's a wound that does not go away. Um, when it comes down to counting on people, no matter who they are, for that support, when it doesn't come, it really, drives down that trust that you were talking about. And I think we've seen that in multiple different ways. I have. Not necessarily the help doesn't come, but sometimes it's the questioning that comes
Yeah.
from that leadership on why would you need support, or why do you need them, and why are you more important than this other mission, or something like that that you see, and then building that trust, and that's probably one of the struggles that I've seen with other veterans that I've talked to. It's always that constant ability to find the flaw in the plan, or find a way to not trust something in the system, which granted we have to understand that there's people that we're all human, we're not perfect like you said, but it's still it makes you very very timid when it comes to putting your life or a big decision in someone else's hand.
Yeah, and with this instance specifically, the individual did have some major trust issues with significant relationships moving forward. And one of the ways that we helped to work through the healing process was to normalize abandonment. And instead of having loved ones say, I'm not cheating on you, or I'm not leaving you, or like, stop being paranoid, we changed language to say, wow, like what you've been through must have been really hard, and create a space of compassion and to actually say like it's actually pretty normal to question this, and you know what, I'm a safe person for you to question that with, and I have no problem proving to you time and time again that I'm not going anywhere or I'm not doing that. And that really helps to bring about this holistic healing. And I think the point to be made in all of this is that one, you got to talk about it, and two, there is hope moving forward, but you have to be willing to admit that it happened, and you have to be able to be willing to work through it in some way. Sometimes, most of the time it's going to be with a trusted professional. um, I think just want to walk through here, just any thoughts or questions we do have. I mean, we started a little late, so we'll take a couple of minutes here to just give a space for if anybody listening there wants to say something or wants to ask a question. Be super happy to help answer that in some way.
Josh, I don't want to. I don't like silence. Well, I do, but um, one thing that I find myself doing is over the years, because of that feeling of failure, and that just drives more of the idea that I'm not good enough, and has really led to a lot of unintentional, I'll call it, self-destruction
Yeah.
that oftentimes opens that we don't see coming. We do it, that you almost want things to fail to prove to yourself how bad you are. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that is a hard reality for a lot of our veterans to really be honest with themselves that that is where we're at.
Yeah.
Um, that we are to the point where we subconsciously want ourselves to fail to prove to our own selves that we're just not good enough. Um,
Yeah, and I may say that well, I may say that a little differently. And it is related. Research shows that the story we tell ourselves is the story that we will live and the story that we will look for. And we will believe whatever it is that we say about ourselves, not because it's true, but because we repeat it more often than we do the truth. And so when we live, especially we live with an inner critic or we live in that space of revisiting the past and saying, I should have done this, essentially what we're telling ourselves is we're not good enough. And because we're telling ourselves we're not good enough, we will look for reasons to confirm why we are not good enough. Because that's the way our brain works. The alternative is also true. If we do tell ourselves that we are worthy of love, that we are good enough, that we were doing the best we can, look how far we've come. If we tell ourselves those things, then our mind will start to live and look for those as well. There's maybe a great way to wrap this up because I do want to speak into, at least from a spiritual dynamic, how this comes into play. If any of you are familiar with the story of Saint Francis of Assisi, he was a wealthy his son of a wealthy landowner, and his family had a significant amount of wealth. And when Francis came to faith, when he came to be a follower of Jesus, he renounced his family fortune, and he gave it all up to follow Jesus. And his father never forgave him. And the story goes that when Francis would return to his hometown, his father would come out and curse him publicly. And Francis would bring a friend with him every time he went into town, and he would look to his friend before they walked into town. He says, "When we enter into the gates of the city, my father will come out and he will hurl curses and abuses to me publicly, and I will hear them painfully in one ear. And I need you to whisper God's favor into my other ear. Tell me, Francis, you are my beloved son. You are a beloved son of heaven and a son of God. And keep telling me that until I believe it again." I'm of the opinion that our inner critic or that voice in our head is always telling us something cruel and untrue above ourselves. And we need people who are willing to be friends in the other ear, speaking truth and love and hope into us until we believe it. And that's really what OIS stands for. That's what this whole initiative is about creating a band of family, brothers and sisters who will lock arm in arm with us, speak truth into us and say, listen, I'm here. I'm here to help. And so I just want to leave you with that thought that this whole webinar series, this whole plan is to create a space where you can get the help you need. And you are not alone, and we are for you. And that is the end of our first webinar talking about moral injury and post-traumatic stress. And we're going to continue on. A couple of things that I just want to leave you with. One, if you did get the guide along with this, I also created 20 wellness thoughts. So it's basically a wellness devotional of 20 things that you can do every day to help regulate and ground yourself. And so that was created by me, and I gave that to OIS as well. We'll continue to have that available for you, but those are resources that you can have and you can count on. So thankful for our time together, and we will continue to go on with this webinar throughout the course of the year. And that's all we have for now.